Lily stared at her reflection in the mirror, her heart heavy beneath the weight of the wedding gown. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, yet all she felt was an overwhelming sense of resignation. At 24, she had dreamed of a love story filled with passion and devotion, not an arrangement that left her feeling like a spectator in her own life. She barely knew the man she was about to marry, older, wealthy, and chosen more by circumstance than by choice. But as the ceremony approached, Lily had no idea that the biggest surprise of her life was waiting just ahead. Lily walked slowly down the flower-lined aisle, clutching her bouquet tightly. Every pair of eyes in the room was on her, yet she felt as if she were walking into a fate that was never hers to choose. At the end of the aisle stood Ethan Carter, the man she was about to marry. His expression was calm, his deep-set eyes unreadable. He was nearly 20 years older than her, wealthy, powerful. A man like him could have married anyone, so why had he chosen her? Lily had never truly understood the reason. Her family assured her that this marriage was in everyone's best interest, but she had yet to see how it benefited her. Her heart pounded as the officiant began the ceremony. Ethan's gaze remained steady on her, gentle yet mysterious. "Do you, Ethan Carter, take Lily Evans to be your wife?" Ethan hesitated for a brief moment, not out of doubt, but as if he was carefully considering his answer. Then, locking eyes with her, he spoke with quiet certainty. "I do." Lily's grip on her bouquet tightened as the attention turned to her. "And do you, Lily Evans, take Ethan Carter to be your husband?" The weight of the moment pressed down on her. Every instinct in her told her to say no. But then, something flickered in Ethan's eyes, a brief moment of sadness, almost as if he knew she was afraid, as if he was waiting for her to see something she had overlooked. A strange feeling settled in her chest. She thought back to the past few weeks, the hushed conversations between Ethan and her father, the times he had appeared just in time to shield her from things she hadn't even realized were dangerous, the concern that lingered in his gaze whenever he looked at her. The room fell into silence as Lily hesitated. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She could feel the weight of expectations, her family's, the guests', and most of all, Ethan's. Her lips parted, but she wasn't sure what words would come out. Then, just for a moment, Ethan leaned in slightly, his voice barely above a whisper, meant only for her. "Lily," he murmured, "you are free to walk away, but if you stay, I promise you, I will protect you." A chill ran down her spine. Protect her? From what? She searched his face for an answer, but all she found was sincerity. No manipulation, no demand, just a quiet plea, a truth unspoken. And in that moment, she made her choice. "I do." The words left her lips before she could second-guess herself. Applause broke out around the room, but all she could hear was the pounding of her own heart. Ethan slid the ring onto her finger, his touch warm, steady. But as they turned to face the crowd, as husband and wife, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that she had just stepped into something far bigger than she understood. The reception was a blur of polite conversations, champagne toasts, and well-wishers. Lily smiled when expected, danced when prompted, but her mind was elsewhere, on Ethan's words at the altar. She needed answers. As she stepped away from the crowd to catch her breath, a man approached her. She had never seen him before, yet something about his presence sent a shiver down her spine. "Mrs. Carter," he said smoothly, tilting his glass. "You don't know me, but you should, because if you knew the truth about your husband, you would have never married him." Lily's breath hitched. "What do you mean?" she demanded. The man chuckled, shaking his head. "Ask him about David Sullivan. Ask him why your marriage was so important to him, and then decide if you really trust the man you just vowed your life to." Before she could press for more, he disappeared into the crowd, leaving Lily standing there, her wedding ring suddenly feeling heavier on her hand. She turned her gaze toward Ethan. He was across the room watching her. Had he seen the exchange? Had he anticipated it? David Sullivan. She didn't know the name, but something told her that whatever it meant, it would change everything. Lily's fingers trembled around the stem of her champagne glass. The name, David Sullivan, echoed in her mind like a ghost from a past she didn't remember. She stole another glance at Ethan. He was still across the room, engaged in quiet conversation with an older gentleman, but something about the way he carried himself had changed. His posture was still composed, his expression unreadable, but his shoulders were slightly tense. Had he seen the stranger speak to her? Had he expected it? A war raged inside her. Ethan had told her she was free to leave, yet he had also promised to protect her. That meant he knew something she didn't, something that required protection. And now she needed to find out what. Later that night, after the last guest had left and the house had fallen into an uneasy quiet, Lily found Ethan in his study. He was pouring himself a drink, the dim glow of the lamp casting long shadows around him. She didn't wait. "Who is David Sullivan?" Ethan stilled, the glass hovering just inches from his lips. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer, but then, with a quiet sigh, he set the drink down and turned to face her. "Where did you hear that name?" His voice was calm, but there was something else beneath it, a carefully controlled weight. Lily crossed her arms. "A man at the wedding. He said if I knew the truth, I wouldn't have married you." Ethan studied her for a long moment before finally speaking. "David Sullivan was your father's business partner." She blinked. That wasn't what she had expected. "Was?" she pressed. Ethan exhaled. "He's dead, Lily." A chill crept up her spine. "And what does that have to do with me?" "Everything." Lily's breath hitched. Ethan walked toward her, his expression softer now, as if he had hoped to spare her from this conversation. "Your father never told you, did he? About the debt?" She frowned. "Debt?" Ethan nodded. "Your father and David built an empire together. But when things started falling apart, David wanted out. Your father, he was desperate. He took money from the wrong people, people who don't forgive debts." Lily's stomach twisted. "What are you saying?" Ethan's gaze held hers, steady and unwavering. "I married you to protect you, Lily, because if I hadn't, they would have come for you instead." Silence settled between them, thick with unspoken truths. Lily's world tilted. She had spent weeks believing she was being forced into a loveless marriage, into a future dictated by power and wealth. But the truth was far more terrifying. She had been on the edge of danger without even knowing it. And Ethan Carter, he wasn't her captor. He was her shield. Lily turned away, pacing toward the window. The city lights flickered in the distance, indifferent to the storm inside her. She should be angry. She should feel betrayed. And yet all she could feel was relief. Ethan had no reason to protect her, no reason to tie himself to her future. Yet he had done so without ever asking for her trust in return. "You should have told me." Her voice was quiet, but not accusing. Ethan nodded. "I know, but I needed you to choose this marriage for yourself, not out of fear." She turned to face him, searching his expression for any sign of deception. She found none. "And now?" she asked. Ethan stepped closer, his voice gentle yet certain. "Now you decide what happens next." Lily stared at him, at the man she had once feared but now saw in a completely different light. She had thought she was walking into a prison. Instead, she had been given a choice. For the first time that night, she truly understood the weight of the words she had spoken at the altar. "I do." Lily sat by the window of their shared bedroom, staring out at the quiet city. The revelation of her father's debt and the reason behind her marriage still echoed in her mind. The night was deep, yet sleep refused to come. Ethan had told her the truth, or at least part of it. That much she was certain of. But there were still pieces missing. The name David Sullivan wasn't just a footnote in her father's past. It carried something heavier, something Ethan had yet to reveal. She glanced at him across the room. He had removed his suit jacket, his sleeves rolled up as he sat at his desk, reading through a stack of documents. He looked as composed as ever, yet there was an undeniable tension in his posture. The man who had promised to protect her was also a man burdened by secrets. Lily wasn't sure if she should be grateful or afraid. The days that followed were quiet, almost deceptively normal. Ethan carried on with his work, and Lily tried to adjust to her new life. But there was an unspoken understanding between them. This wasn't over. The weight of the name David Sullivan lingered like a shadow. One afternoon, as she explored the house, she found a study filled with old records and papers. She ran her fingers along the spines of the books, searching for anything that might give her clarity. And then she saw it. A thin, worn-out folder tucked away in a drawer. The name Sullivan was scrawled across the top. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were old photographs. Her father, younger and full of ambition, standing beside a man she didn't recognize. Documents detailing business transactions, newspaper clippings, and then at the bottom of the stack a police report. Her breath caught in her throat. David Sullivan's death hadn't been an accident. He had been murdered. Ethan found her in the study, the folder open in her lap, her face pale. She didn't need to ask if he had known. His expression told her everything. David Sullivan hadn't just been her father's business partner. His death had left behind loose ends, ones that were never truly buried. And now she was part of it. Lily had thought marriage to Ethan was a sacrifice, a burden forced upon her. But the truth was far more complicated. She wasn't just his wife. She was now tied to a past that had never let go. And whether she wanted to or not, she would have to face it. Lily stared at the police report, her heartbeat a steady drum in her ears. The words were clear. David Sullivan had been murdered. The details were vague, but one thing stood out. No suspect had ever been named. His death had been written off as a failed robbery, but looking at the documents before her, she knew better. Ethan watched her carefully, his face unreadable. There was no doubt in her mind now. Ethan had married her not to trap her, but to protect her from the same forces that had taken David Sullivan's life. She exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of everything settling on her shoulders. She had spent so much time resenting this marriage, fearing it, but now she understood Ethan had never been her enemy. He had been her shield all along. The days passed in quiet reflection. Lily stopped questioning Ethan's motives and instead started asking what came next. She was no longer the naive girl who had been forced into a marriage she didn't understand. She was Ethan Carter's wife, and whether she had chosen it willingly or not, she was part of his world now. And she would not live in fear. One evening, as they stood on the balcony overlooking the city, she finally spoke. "It's time to end this." Ethan turned to her, surprised by the steel in her voice. "No more secrets," she continued. "If there are people who still want revenge, who still hold grudges, I want to know. I want to face them with you." Ethan studied her for a long moment before nodding. For the first time since their marriage began, she saw something shift in his expression: respect. "Then we do this together," he said. Ethan had expected resistance when he started looking for answers, but the moment he reopened the case of David Sullivan's death, the past came knocking faster than expected. A meeting was arranged. In a quiet restaurant late at night, Ethan and Lily sat across from a man who had once been a silent observer of their lives. Richard Hale, a retired investigator who had worked the Sullivan case years ago. "Your father wasn't the only one who owed debts," Hale said, his voice low. "Sullivan wanted out, but someone didn't want him leaving." Lily listened, her hands clenched in her lap. "And now?" Ethan asked. Hale sighed. "The people who had a stake in that business are either gone or too old to care. But someone didn't want you looking too closely. That's why they sent a warning at your wedding." He turned to Lily. Asterisk. "You marrying Ethan forced their hand. They thought he would let it go. But now," he gestured between them, "you've both made it clear you won't." Lily felt Ethan's hand close gently over hers, a silent reassurance. "So what do we do?" she asked. Hale smiled faintly. "You live. You let them know that whatever happened in the past, it ends here." And for the first time in weeks, Lily felt like she could finally breathe. The shadows of the past didn't disappear overnight, but they no longer dictated Lily's future. The marriage that had once felt like a prison had become her refuge. And the man she had feared had become the one person she trusted most. One evening, as they walked through their home, she turned to Ethan with a soft smile. "I never thanked you," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For not forcing me into this marriage. For giving me the choice, even when I didn't realize it." Ethan reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "You were never trapped, Lily. You just needed time to see it." She nodded, her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. The ghosts of the past had finally been laid to rest. And for the first time, their marriage was no longer built on necessity. It was built on trust. And maybe, just maybe, on something even more.